The affair between Ackerman and science fiction has lasted for nearly 50 years. A creature unique to science fiction is the science fiction fan, a genus of the species Homo sapiens with an enlarged and overactive imagination found usually in small groups or large conventions talking about science fiction, about authors, or about fandom as a way of life. Forrest J. Ackerman has had many careers: author, agent, editor, columnist, collector. But all have been related to his lifelong love, science fiction. Forry, as he is known to his friends and correspondents, has made a way of life out of being a fan. He has brought together one of the most complete collections of science fiction magazines and books in the world. And perhaps because of the fact that he has lived all his life near Hollywood, he turned early to an associated medium for science fiction, the film. He originated and edits a magazine about movie monsters, and science fiction might be called the monster that ate Forrest J. Ackerman. Eventually, his collection of books and magazines, motion picture posters, and still photographs grew so extensive that it blotted out every window and began devouring kitchen and bedroom. Forry moved into an apartment and turned his Spanish-style stucco house into a museum. There, in the midst of that incredible collection, he describes the history of the science fiction film.
My name is Forrest J. Ackerman. As I speak to you from the year 1970, I'm 53 years old. For 46 of those years, I've been seeing science fiction films. The first I ever saw was in 1926, The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, his famous novel of a brontosaurus alive today and loose in London. He meddled with things man was meant to leave alone. He tampered in God's domain. These anti-science cliches that have dominated the majority of science fiction films, but never dampened the ardor of the mad scientist persecuted by superstitious mankind. Boris Karloff acted into his 81st year and suffered horrendous fates for daring to probe beyond the bounds of orthodox science. And what were some of these blasphemous experiments? Cryogenics in The Man with 9 Lives, 1940. Prolongation of life with an artificial heart in The Man They Could Not Hang, 1939. Revivification of an electrocuted man in The Walking Dead, 1936. Have screen playwrights, producers, motion picture companies really believe the myth of too much science being a bad thing? Not really. Mad science merely means good box office, just as horror headlines sell newspapers. There have been a few films about sane scientists. The Story of Louis Pasteur, Sinclair Lewis' Aerosmith, Dr. Ehrlich's Magic Bullet, the syphilis story. But the general public, in picking pictures, has evidenced a greater interest in scientists who shrink people or appropriate their brains or render them invisible than those good Samaritans who seek a cure for cancer or emphysema. Before chronicling the science fiction film history further, I imagine it's probably desirable to define the genre. Unknown ever. That compilation was published on the first page of the first amateur science fiction magazine, the Time Traveler, at the beginning of 1932. I created the list. Today, I don't agree with many of my own selections. For instance, by no stretch of the imagination would I now include the outright supernatural Dracula. I think a science fiction film pretty well defines itself. Most of the pictures are about inventions or catastrophes outside the normal, experiments gone disastrously wrong, life on or from other worlds, the multiple extrapolations of the future. Now, accepting the possibility of chemically separating the evil nature of man from the good, and the first science fiction film may very well have been a short Scandinavian version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1897. The Jekyll-Hyde syndrome, with the inevitable son and daughter sequels, seems to hold the record for remakes, with something like 25 versions to date. Ruben Mamoulian's classic of 1932 garnered an Academy Award for its star, Frederick March, in the dual role of man and monster. In 1898, Georges Méliès, the cinemagician of France, produced the short lunar fantasy, An Astronomer's Dream, following it in 1899 with a brief sequence from H. Rider Haggard's She, showing the rejuvenation of the immortal goddess in a film called Column of Fire. Best known early example of science fiction on film surviving to this day is the French 1902 combination of elements from Verne's From the Earth to the Moon in a short science farce. In 1909, French Pathé audiences were taken on a trip to Jupiter. In the following year, the film company of Thomas Edison himself offered a trip to Mars. A daring flight repeated 8 years later by a Danish film producer with Skyship, and again in 1920 by Tower Films. In 1919, England finally filmed the first men in the moon by its most famous SF son, H.G. Wells. But it remained for the greatest animator of his time, Ray Harryhausen, to make the definitive version in 1965. A Message from Mars, 1921, was a utopian morality play transferred to film, while Radiomania, 1923, gave us an amusingly imaginative look at the weird inhabitants of our neighbor planet. The Russians filmed a highly stylized civilization of robotic Martians in A Elita, 1924, and Science and Invention magazine for 1923 records the highly unusual story of the Stellar Express, the rocket ship that flew faster than light, with the result that its astronaut, after landing on a distant planet, observed through a telescope his own arrival. Our heavenly bodies, German-made in 1926, would appear to be a lost masterpiece, perhaps the most serious, ambitious space film ever made. A few surviving stills show us an ether ship taking off from a metropolis of a future century and engaging in a more literal sense in the much later Cinerama production of the same name in a space odyssey. The weightlessness of the crew appears to have been convincingly portrayed. I believe the conclusion of this picture depicted several ways that the world might come to an end, as by fire or freezing, and that portions of these were incorporated in either a film called Evolution or The Mystery of Life. They were two separate pictures, one or possibly both of which I saw a single time at the beginning of the 30s. Fritz Lang, of course, made Frau im rocket to the moon, as it was variously known, and that was shown here and abroad in 1929, the year that he actually on film invented countdown. Lang's moon, wrongly, had an atmosphere, rightly a powdery surface. A Trip to Mars was taken the following year, 1930, in the farcical music comedy Just Imagine, which will be covered later when I discuss future films. Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers rocketed around the universe in 4 serials from 1936 through 1940. But of course, these chapter plays bear the same relationship to science fiction films in general as comic strips to magazine and book science fiction. The first space film with international impact in the era of talking pictures was George Pal's Destination Moon in 1949, in color, with the fortuitous and felicitous combination of author Robert A. Heinlein and artist Chesley Bonestell collaborating closely on the creation of a memorable work, with Willie Lay as the technical advisor. 20 years ahead of the reality of 20 July 1969, the picture was a praiseworthy effort, flawed only slightly by the unnecessary comic relief. Space films to follow, such as This Island Earth in 1955 and Forbidden Planet in 1956, were less documentary and more daring-do, culminating in the multi-million-dollar, brain-bewildering 2001 of Arthur Clarke and Stanley Kubrick. No science fiction film since Metropolis has been received with such religious fervor and fanatic devotion, or else condemned with passionate displeasure. No viewer, pro or con, faulted it for its fabulous special effects, but arguments will probably still rage into the 21st century as to what the significance of its ending was, if indeed it had any. Space per se has rarely inspired productions above a lowbrow level in the films, mirroring more the hackwork space operas of old pulp publications such as Planet Stories, which eloquently emphasize the inarguable some years ago that, quote, 90% of everything printed, and by extension filmed, is of inferior quality. Space pictures from Japan, Italy, and elsewhere other than Russia have been pretty much of a piece, all pyrotechnics and tinker toy models. Leaving space for a look at the future, we turn back the clock to 1926, Metropolis. It was the best, the technical and technological masterpiece of Austrian auteur Fritz Lang, which is an indelible creation of a unique supercity of 60 million people held in the thrall of incredible malignant machinery, and features Ultima Futura Automaton, the most glamorous robot ever to grace the screen. I have been known to lecture an hour and a quarter extemporaneously about the merits of this single film, which I've seen perhaps 25 times to date. It is obvious that in this limited time I must hastily pass on to other futuristic productions, summarizing Metropolis succinctly as the supreme achievement of filmic future history. Just Imagine, made in 1930, forecast the world of 9 indexed numbers, where Mia Farrow's mother, Maureen O'Sullivan, was the numeral named LN18, who sang to her hero J21 when he was a captive on Mars of the race of bad twin Martians. Incredibly infantile in its plot and humor, no more than 5 or 10 minutes of the entire film are worth watching. But the Gotham of 1980 was probably more breathtaking in its aerially photographed grandeur than the reality that will soon overtake us. Indeed, one day, if you are studying this course beyond 1980, may be in the past. High Treason, the second British talking film released in the USA in 1930, forecast the world and the war of 1940. There was a Channel tunnel between London and Paris, which was blown up, photo phones to see the person conversed with, bombed by enemy Zeppelins of the Europans, While the MGM plea for pacifism in 1933, Men Must Fight, was similar in theme, but inferior in effects to High Treason. Other glimpses of the future were seen in FP1 Does Not Answer, 1933's vision of transoceanic flights to come, the German Tunnel of 1933 and its British remake of 1935, Transatlantic Tunnel, the German Gold, Transmutation of Elements, and Master of the World, Robots, in the mid-30s, up to the fair adaptation in 1956 of George Orwell's frightening literary warning, 1984. But less than inspired adaptation, 1967, of Ray Bradbury's powerful book-burning extrapolation, Fahrenheit 451. The French Alphaville and Italian Tenth Victim, both 1965 releases, were perverse projections of possible futures. H.G. Wells in Things to Come, 1935, created a science-film masterpiece for all time. If you have seen Things to Come and rated less than memorable, you flunked the course. I have seen it in excess of 40 times, a record which I think attests to my estimate of the value of the film. The themes treated in science fiction films have been many. Among those worth noting, invisibility, H.G. Wells' Invisible Man, 1933, superior in all respects. Lilliputianism, the adaptation of The Incredible Shrinking Man by the book's own author, Richard Matheson, with first-rate effects in 1957. The breathtaking Fantastic Voyage in a miniaturized submarine through the human body in 1966. Other only slightly less effective shrinking stories were Dr. Cyclops in 1939 and the film that was based on A. Merritt's famous book Burn Witch Burn called The Devil Doll, made in 1936. This is a series of stills demonstrating the created for the film. No really superior treatment of a gigantic human has yet been filmed. The purchased but unproduced Nth Man might possibly be the answer to this, but giant beasts, things, and creatures have abounded. King Kong of 1933 being the classic hallowed by time. This is the actual model of the pteranodon which was attempting to fly away with Fay Wray in the production of King Kong. This is the sea beast that reared up and overturned the raft. This, the remnants of the brontosaurus that treed one of the many members of Denham's doomed party, the triceratops. And this is believed to be the metal skeleton of the Tyrannosaurus Rex, which had the monumental battle with King Kong and was finally bested by him. This, the creature called the Emir, the plastic prototype of it, which was created by Ray Harryhausen for his film about Venus called 20 Million Miles to Earth. Time, smog, simply air itself are unkind to creatures like this hand puppet, which in 1955 was the ferocious beast with a million eyes. The new breed of model makers of the 70s may be giving some thought to the preservation of their miniature creations, but maestros like Marcel Delgado of yesteryear no more anticipated their models would be collected, respected, dissected, studied, cherished, preserved than manufacturers of, say, cigar bands. Longevity has proven a popular theme in Black Oxen of 1924, The Young Diana of 1922, The Man in Half Moon Street, 1944, and its subsequent remake, The Man Who Could Cheat Death, 1958. No one ever seems to actually win the war with the Grim Reaper, however, and inevitably the artificially preserved people age years in seconds in the grim climaxes. From Lost Horizon to The Leech Woman, it ritualistically happens. After dreaming as a young man of the spectacular destruction of the earth by comets, how dull and boring the end of the world could be when I saw the French version of 1931. At a revival in 1969, the picture had not improved with age. Deluge, to my mind, remains the definitive world destruction depiction. When in 1933, on a tabletop at a cost of $25,000, New York City's skyscrapers were toppled by earth-wrenching quakes, then the stricken island of Manhattan drowned by tidal waves. The amazing achievement by Ned Mann was reprised in an otherwise weak film known as SOS Tidal Wave. The same cataclysm depicted in 1951 in When Worlds Collide was pale by comparison, although the Bomber Wiley novel, produced in color by George Pal, was a superior picture of the two. Two very interesting variations on the theme, however, were The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, and Neville Shute's bestseller, On the Beach, released in 1959 and 1960, respectively. Al Rauna, the artificially created soulless woman, has heartlessly caused men to lose their heads no fewer than 7 times in a variety of European versions, the last of which, Unnatural, featured Erich von Stroheim. Barbarella, incarnated by Jane Fonda, was an astronauty adventuress of many millennia hence, whose gadgetry would have made Buck Rogers green with jealousy, as in 1968 she did her thing in Roger Vadim's incredibly lush, bizarre, exotic, decadent depiction of a phantasmagorical cosmic future from the comic-oriented mind of French artist Jean-Claude Forrest. Fared better The Day the Earth Stood Still, from the Harry Bates novelette anthologized in Adventures in Time and Space, original story title, Farewell to the Master. The Thing from Another World, 1951, by John W. Campbell, to be found in the same collection under its original magazine title of Who Goes There? Actual clause of The Thing from Another World, as modeled for us today by James Gunn. Thank you, Mr. Gunn, for a very effective demonstration of the clause. And 1941, there was The Devil Commands, a Boris Karloff attempt to scientifically establish communication with the astral plane based on the well-received book by William Sloane, The Edge of Running Water, and the especially effective adaptation of John Wyndham's best book, The Midwich Cuckoos, filmed in 1960 as Village of the Damned. Wyndham's watershed work, The Day of the Triffids, was not quite the success of its Midwich predecessor when it reached the screen in 1963. Frankenstein, the world's #1 nightmare conceived in the teenage mind of Mary Shelley in 1816, first reached the screen in 1910 via the film company of Thomas Alva Edison, was filmed a second time as Life Without Soul in 1915, The Monster of Frankenstein, Italian, in 1920, and then definitively in 1931 with Boris Karloff. A German serial in 6-hour-long installments called Homunculus was released in 1916 and climaxed with its soulless artificial creature meeting death at the hands of nature via a lightning bolt, as Wiley's Gladiator would do many years later. In addition to films previously called to your attention as worthwhile or outstanding, serious students of the science fiction cinema cannot afford to miss a viewing of any of the following should the opportunity afford itself. The War of the Worlds, George Pal out of H.G. Wells, with breathtaking special effects, which in fact won an Oscar in 1953 This is the actual model of the Martian war machine. The Island of Lost Souls, 1932. Screenplay from H.G. Wells' Island of Dr. Moreau, treating insidiously of the accelerated evolution of animals into manimals. The invisible ray, see it, they're mad, bad scientists at best. Dr. X, 1932, a gripping scientific mystery with a chilling climax featuring synthetic flesh. The Mysterious Island, a milestone for its time, 1929, with a subsea civilization discovered by Verne's Pioneer submarines, a creation of haunting beauty. It came from outer space, 1953, about 85% pure Ray Bradbury, and in third dimension. Them, Best of the Giant Insect Tales in 1954. The Time Machine, 1960, favorite of some George Pal enthusiasts. The Planet of the Apes, 1968, an eminently satisfactory treatment of screen science fiction. Journey to the Far Side of the Sun, 1969, excelled with its realistic models, obviously influenced by the first-rate miniature work of 2001. And what conclusions are to be drawn after 70 years of science fiction on the screen? The estimate of those most knowledgeable in the field, Walter Lee and Carlos Clarence of America, Louis Gasca of Spain, John Baxter of England, Lotte Eisner, France, the Belgian Groupe d'études pour le cinéma fantastique, pronunciation of which I don't guarantee. Esperanto is my native language. But these experts estimate that a figure approaching 2,500 is the number of films which SF cineasts would agree on as having been produced during the first 7 decades of the 20th century. 2,500 films. But how many classics? How many even based on magazine stories or books? How much richer the past history of SF films could have been had producers reached into the pages of Astounding and Galaxy magazine, the minds of men like Asimov and Van Vogt and Frederick Pohl. Quality and box office are not entities alien to each other. The time is long past when we should already have seen Brave New World, Looking Backward, R.U.R., The Vicarian, The World Below, Ralph 124C 41 Plus, To Walk the Night, Sinister Barrier, Slan, The World of Null, The Martian Chronicles, The Voyage of the Space Beagle, Odd John, half of Heinlein, a lot of Sturgeon and Weinbaum, and Stapleton and Van Vogt and Campbell, and even much more of H.G. Wells. Pioneers of basic ideas of science fiction like Ray Cummings, Edmund Hamilton, Jack Williamson have been shamefully neglected. Their works overlooked when themes they either originated or perfected frequently were scripted by latecomers or non-entities not even associated with the field. Study the best of the past. Fritz Lang, for imaginative interpretation of his written material. Jack Pierce, for the ultimate in makeup. Boris Karloff, for integrity of performances. George Pal, for subject matter. James Whale, for direction. Karl Freund, for camera work. Marcel Delgado, for prehistoric life models. Willis O'Brien and Ray Harryhausen for animation. Kenneth Strickfaden for electrical laboratory. Max Steiner for musical scores. There were 13 golden years of science fiction film fantasy, and were from 1923 through 1936. Whenever you can, see the fantastic films of this period, including The Phantom of the Opera, Siegfried, Faust, The Magician, and similar motion pictures, for there are many of the same elements in them as in the science fiction films. The dragon of Siegfried is not so different from a dinosaur of the Lost World. The laboratory of the magician could serve for the young Diana. Lastly, a personal note. I'm sure author Theodore Sturgeon would happily be made out a liar were his observed law of mediocrity to be science fiction films became superior, and only 10% were worthless trash. I've seen every science fiction film made possible to me in approximately 50 years, more I believe than anyone else on Earth. I plan to continue to do so until at least 2001. It would be a great reward to me, one shared in by all interested in the subject matter, if there should be a noticeable increase in the quality of science fiction films in the years from here to the 21st century. The message of Metropolis was that halfway between the hand and the brain must be the heart. Dr. Ackerman's diagnosis is that if you have it in your hearts to do so, then use your hands and your heads to improve on the past. Whenever any opportunity presents itself for you to select, project, view, criticize, or create that most challenging of motion picture art forms, science fiction film, do so with one eye on the past and one on the future. In fact, considering the strangeness of the subject matter, it would not be amiss to operate with three eyes, by which I mean intelligence, imagination, and integrity.